Welcome to the 5th season of Decision Points. I'm David Makovsky, the Ziegler Distinguished Fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. I'm glad to go on this journey with you. We find ourselves at the close of 2024, a moment shaped by seismic geopolitical shifts in the Middle East. Thanks to Israeli strikes in October, Iran no longer has advanced air defenses and is vulnerable to a future strike. Iran's proxy network across the region has suffered devastating blows. Hezbollah has been set back many years. Hamas's leadership and its army has been decimated, and the Assad regime in Syria has fallen. Taken together, all of this is bound to reshape Israel's security outlook. Moreover, for the first time since the release of 105 hostages in November 2023, officials in many governments suggest the prospect of at least a partial hostage deal seems more possible. But as we know from the past year, there are no guarantees. Yet, amidst this shift in the regional balance of power that is more favorable to Israel, Israeli society has been navigating a complex emotional and political landscape. The Gaza war has taken its toll. Reserve duty is at a record high as the country is facing a grueling seven-front war, and profound internal divisions are reasserting themselves. As 2024 ends, the nation faces a mix of optimism and uncertainty. How is Israeli society processing the growing possibility of a partial hostage deal after over a year of failed starts? How will tensions between the Trump administration's desire to end the war and the Israeli hard right's push to remain in Gaza indefinitely and continue the fighting play out? How are domestic political controversies influencing Israel's geopolitical strategy, and how do they impact the durability of the current governing Netanyahu coalition? And what role, if any, does Netanyahu's ongoing trial play at this critical moment? To help us gauge the pulse of Israeli society at the end of 2024 and looking ahead to 2025, I'm joined once again by veteran keen observer Yossi Klein Halevi. Yossi is a senior fellow at the Shalom Hartman Institute in Jerusalem. He's the author of several acclaimed books on the conflict, including the New York Times bestseller, Letters to My Palestinian Neighbor, and he's co-host of the Institute's podcast, For Heaven's Sake. Yossi Klein Halevi, welcome back to Decision Points. It's a delight to have you.
There are very few people I'd rather spend an hour with than you, David.
Well, same here, Yossi, so thank you very much. You know, we're trying to look at this episode to sum up a seismic year, both the upside, the downside, and crystal balls could be very cloudy at a time of war. But to try to look ahead for 2025 for Israel, and where is the public in Israel, and how does it intersect with developments of the government on key issues? We want to begin, and at the time of this taping, there's not yet a hostage deal, but there's more optimism, I would say, than we've seen in months. Of course, there could be a false optimism. We don't know. And the question is, how does the public digest what looks like a partial hostage deal? You know, focusing on women, elderly, and injured, but maybe the remaining 2/3 of the hostages might not be released, and we don't know how many are alive and how many are dead. And I look at the polling data almost every day that's coming out, and the public wants a deal, even if it means ending the war. So is a partial deal, you could say, well, it's better than nothing, but it might also mean the languishing of many of the hostages who are still alive when people feel the time is running out. So how do you think the people are digesting this?
Well, I think that after more than a year, a partial deal isn't good enough. And this is going to be a wrenching moment because on the one hand, everyone is going to be rejoicing with the families and the hostages that have been released, that will be released. And on the other hand, there's going to be a tremendous amount of anger at the government for not going all the way, for not doing in Gaza what it did in Lebanon, which is total ceasefire, end of the war, and get all the hostages back at once. And you're going to see a great deal of political anger emerging because the hostage families and their supporters will, I think justifiably, accuse Netanyahu of once again playing politics, of not ending the war in Gaza because he knows that would risk the stability of his coalition. The far right have threatened to bolt if he completely ends the war in Gaza. And I think behind that is something even more nefarious, which is the far right's endgame, which is to rebuild the settlements in Gaza. And so what you're going to hear, I suspect, in the coming days, if it is a partial deal, Netanyahu has given into the blackmail of the far right and essentially traded the lives of the remaining hostages for the possibility of settlements in Gaza. And whether that's a fair critique or not, I think that's what you're going to hear.
I'm sure the critics will emerge and say, look, what you had to give up even for a partial deal. You know, Sinwar came out of the last round and it was 1,000 people and 1,027. And look what emerged. I mean, is he counting on a kind of silent backlash of people who will say, this is as far as Israel can go because it's just too risky to let these other terrorists out of prison?
In terms of this first stage of presumably a gradation of arrangements, what's interesting is the far right, unlike in previous occasions, the far right is not delivering any ultimatums. It's not saying don't go for a deal. Everyone knows a deal seems to be in the works, and yet we're not hearing from Smotrich and Ben-Gvir the kind of threats we heard in the past, which means that they've made their reluctant peace with a partial deal. A partial deal, I think, is something the far right has decided it can live with, but that's not necessarily something that a majority of Israelis can live with anymore.
In some ways, 2024, it seems like almost Dickens, the best of times, the worst of times, that Israel's had all the strategic successes that we'll talk about with Hezbollah and Iran and the fall of Assad. And yet, since you mentioned the far right in Gaza, it's very hard in America, certainly, to understand how does a country proceed without a strategy on the future of Gaza. When Gadi Eisenkot, who lost his son in battle and he lost two nephews, and he notes at the memorial that this is the fourth time in Jabalia. How does the public internalize that? Doesn't seem to be a day after approach. I mean, if you want to defeat Hamas, you want to compete with Hamas. You don't want to leave a vacuum that's a Mogadishu chaos and that Hamas just tries to fill that vacuum. How does Netanyahu able to persuade the public that it's really not so critical right now?
I think the answer is much more prosaic than what you're asking about, which is that it's not really on the radar of much of the public. This hasn't been a heavily debated issue. What do we do the morning after? I think that the Israeli public is still, in some sense, so deeply traumatized that we're taking things one day at a time. And Netanyahu has exploited that confusion by adopting a non-policy of confusion. And he hasn't been called out on this, even by the opposition in any meaningful sense. God willing, when the hostage arrangement starts to become real, that may begin to trigger a conversation, the kind of public conversation we need about what actually is the morning after going to look like. Right now, that's just simply not part of the conversation.
So the good news, so to speak, and again, in the Middle East, things are so fluid, things could change, but it is somewhat feeling like Israel is living through such a seismic earthquake. The Iran proxy network has been really battered. The Assad regime, a staple for Israel for 54 years and beyond. Hamas is a shell of what it was. And Iran has no air defenses that make it much more vulnerable. And Hezbollah has been decimated. Its leadership has been decapitated. I see it in talking even to Arab diplomats, a feeling that this is a time where Israel looks like it's standing tall. Maybe in Gaza, it looks horribly internationally, but in the region, against radical forces, Israel's had an incredible several set of months that looks like there's a real even shift in the regional balance of power. How much of that do you think the Israeli public is absorbing, this duality between the depths of the war and yet all these successes on the battlefields? And then it gets to the question of how do you translate this into enduring strategic gains?
That's a conversation that we haven't begun to have here. events have been moving so quickly that it's really hard to process what's happened. I think for many of us, and certainly I include myself in this, a part of me is still stuck in October 7th and is still looking at the breached border and the army's catastrophic response in those first hours when Hamas took over the kibbutzim and parts of Sderot. And we're still asking ourselves, what happened to us? David, don't forget that until October 7th, the trauma of the Yom Kippur War was still very much a part of the Israeli consciousness. And the irony was that in the weeks leading up to October 7th, the Israeli media was obsessed with the question, how could we have been taken by surprise on Yom Kippur? And then, irony of ironies, 50 years later, almost to the day, we're taken by surprise in an even more devastating way. And so we haven't begun to process the extraordinary failure of October 7th. And this is something I think that people abroad don't fully appreciate. The lingering trauma of October 7th, long after the atrocities, the memories of the atrocities begin to lose their acuteness, we are still going to be looking at October 7th with open mouths and saying, how could this possibly have happened to us? So where I'm at, and I suspect many Israelis as well are at, is trying to absorb this extraordinary turnaround where suddenly we're back. You know, Tom Friedman said it's the Six-Day War. I don't think it's the Six-Day War. I think it's very impressive. It's very powerful. But the Six-Day War was not preceded by October 7th. And October 7th lingers not only, I suspect, in our consciousness, but also in the region. On some level, October 7th showed our enemies that it's possible to actually defeat us. And that memory is there now. It's a scenario. What we experienced on October 7th was a pre-enactment of what the destruction of Israel would look like. No borders, civilians left to fend for themselves, the army in complete disarray. Those images are not going away. You spoke about a dichotomy between Israel's victories and the absence of a coherent morning after plan. I think the emotional dichotomy that we're living with still is between October 7th and the beepers. As a citizen, what do I do with that? Who are we?
You have often talked about the Iran nuclear issue, and I sense, even here in Washington, and Israelis come through here a lot, I sense a real shift in the conversation from something that seemed more on the conceptual frame to something that is much more tangible. You could say, well, okay, Israel's had 2 rounds with Iran back and forth. Russia can't replace right now their air defense system, the S-300s, because they need their S-300s in Ukraine and Russia. And you sense an attack on Iran has gone from maybe yes, maybe not, to 2025 could be the year. It's not just, it seems more imminent, but it seems that it's a different kind of a conversation, that now the pathway has been laid. And it's really a fascinating shift, I find, on the policy level. And ironically, it plays out in maybe unpredictable ways. You see that Trump is viewed as someone who likes to say, I want to end wars, I don't want to begin wars. But he's also maybe, well, I'll back Israel if Israel wants to do it. But can Israel do it? Because when it comes to the Fordo Mountain, Israel doesn't have the bunker busters and the planes that are big enough to carry these bunker busters that it doesn't have. Some people say, you know, you need Trump more, and Trump is going to do it the Trump way. He wants to use what he calls massive pressure economically on sanctions and play it out. And Israel say, look, we don't have that time. Right now, the war in the Ukraine is going on. Russia can't resupply them. This is the moment. Do it, attack now, or you'll never do it. And people like Yossi Klein Halevi are going to write books saying you had that moment in 2025 and the window shut. And that this is a moment of history that shifted. But I sense in Washington, and I'm just telling you my impression, it's a different tenor of the conversation. I don't expect the Israeli public to be kind of engaged in that conversation because, as you say, they're so traumatized. But having gone back and forth with Iran in April and in October, I sense Israel is, on the policy level, is not where it was. It's a much more question of mechanics and how and which way, whether then should it or shouldn't it.
My nightmare is that this war will end with Iran still on the nuclear threshold. And if that's the case, then Israel will have decisively lost this war, no matter what other achievements we had. You know, David, Iran had two historic strategic victories over Israel in the last years. The first was to surround us on virtually every border with this ring of fire. And our resounding victory has been to break the Iranian siege on our borders. But the second Iranian strategic victory was to position itself on the nuclear threshold. And it's still there. And I don't trust Netanyahu's resolve, even though he's made Iran his calling card issue over the years. My hope is that Trump will say to us, all right, you want to deal with Iran, you deal with it. You tell us what you need, we'll give you the weapons, but don't expect any backup from us if you screw up. And that's fine. I can live with that, with that deal. That's a Trumpian deal. And I hope it happens.
The other way to go is that Iran, very much aware that it is in a corner because its proxy network, the Ring of Fire, as you correctly call it, from the Qasem Soleimani, the notorious architect of the Al-Quds Force who set it up, that will say, listen, Iran will say, look, we're in a corner. Let's just cut a deal with Trump right now at the IAEA, because otherwise Israel's going to attack. And maybe you'll have a diplomatic deal that some will say, if it's a deal that's really dismantles their nuclear infrastructure, great. Anything you could solve peacefully is something you want to do. But I do wonder if there's a few players in here. It's not just Israel, it's Trump, and it's Iran itself that might realize it doesn't have a good hand to play right now.
There's another scenario, David, which is that Iran concludes that it's lost just about all of its conventional cards. And this is the moment to dash across the threshold.
The question is, do they try to restore deterrence by either rebuilding their proxy network or dash to a bomb? Or do they say, we're in a corner, we've been dealt blow after blow after blow, let's cut a deal?
Well, what do you think? Do you think that they have the capacity to rebuild their network?
I think it'll take a long time. It's clear that if they go the proxy network, they're going to go more on the Houthis. Losing Syria was such a blow to them. They can't resupply over land the way they did. I mean, this will take years. What they might do, Yossi, is they might be clever. And I haven't seen this yet in the press, but I think what they could do more easily is saying, all right, the weapons are going to take years back into Lebanon, but we have money, and let's give money to rebuild our friends, the Shia supporters of Hezbollah. So at least to show that we have not abandoned our people, because once you abandon your people, you're lost. I think that's where Israel didn't really see after 2006 that Iran put in all this money in reconstruction. And once they put in reconstruction, that led to weapons as well.
There are many players here, and so far, Lebanon has not been a player. Lebanon has been a passive victim of Iran and Hezbollah. But I'm wondering whether Lebanon still has any life force left to reassert its independence and try to remove itself from Iranian influence. If this is the moment for them to act.
This is it. I think they got a break in Lebanon, and Israel got a break. It seems that with all the difficulties of whatever the Syrian element is, I just did a podcast on the new Syrian government and can they broaden beyond their Islamist base? Was Turkey going to try to hold them in for all, as much as Turkey's problematic, for their own reasons, might want to focus more on modernization? It's interesting, even with the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, Turkey said, go slow, go slow. But it's clear that for Lebanon, everyone was wondering how fragile the ceasefire is. But losing Assad means no resupply. If you were doing a barometer kind of look, the metrics are much better now towards the end of December than they were at the beginning of December, because there's no Iranian resupply over land in Syria, which was the lifeblood. That was the oxygen. And that gives Lebanon a chance to assert state sovereignty, to have a president, to create institutions, and not let the people who fire the shots call the shots in the case of Hezbollah. So I think that the Syrian collapse of Assad is the best break Lebanon has had in decades. And I think for Israel, it's the best hope that the ceasefire will hold. and it'll take Hezbollah much longer, if at all, to rebuild. I wouldn't count Hezbollah out, but Iran doesn't have the cards in the same way when it had the overland supply. That's the blood supply.
Certainly on October 8th, no one in Israel imagined we'd be in this kind of a strong position a year later. So yeah, the balance is very hopeful.
But with Gaza, the public isn't focused on it, and I'm worried that that is certainly Israel's Achilles heel. Without a strategy, there's a vacuum and Hamas reasserts itself, and I feel you're ending 2024 and going into 2025 in not a good place there. I mean, yes, it's much better that you've hollowed Hamas out, but you can't beat something with nothing. That's what I'm worried about.
Look, one can actually unpack this fragile Israeli optimism and go from front to front and say, yeah, well, so, okay, Syria is out of the Iranian axis, which is extraordinary, but who knows what we're going to face? Are we going to have Al-Qaeda on our border? Al-Qaeda in the Golan? Yes, we've defeated Hezbollah, but we haven't destroyed it. Hezbollah still has fight left in it, and on and on. We're on our way to a very positive outcome, but we're nowhere near there yet.
Yeah, exactly. We're talking about Trump and Bibi, if they're going to be in sync when it comes to Iran. What about on Saudi Arabia? I mean, right now, MBS, Mohammed bin Salman, the crown prince, is saying, I want to do this deal. Bibi, you want to do this deal. Biden has been desperate to want to do this deal. This is the Super Bowl of all peace agreements. It's the Abraham Accords on steroids. But I just realized I have one condition because I have a public too. I might not be democratically elected. Doesn't mean I don't have a public. And unlike democracies that only need 51% to keep going, dictatorships want 100% of the public with them. It's hard to do.
Look, don't forget, David, even Assad only got 99% of the vote.
The joke, Yossi, where they asked Assad, only 0.001% of the people didn't vote for you. What could be better than that? And he responded, their names. So anyway, all right, so let's get back. If Mohammed bin Salman comes to Trump, and I assume there'll be like two kind of schools of thought, but to me, it's clear one school of thought is going to be more dominant. There'll be like a Trump-Kushner wing, and then there'll be, let's say, a Huckabee wing, maybe with David Friedman. Huckabee Friedman would say between annexation and normalization, it's clear you want annexation. And yet I think for Trump and Kushner, which I see as the prevailing wing, they'll say, are you crazy? Of course we want normalization. And if you have to pay something on the Palestinian issue, if it's a negotiation to two states, it doesn't mean it is two states. It means it's a negotiation where they may want some sort of recognition, even of the status quo, which I don't exactly understand how that's going to work. But Mohammed bin Salman says, I'm the leader of the Muslim world, not just the Arab world. You got to give me something. What happens? Does Bibi and Trump, do they get in sync? I mean, it seems to me it's easy for Bibi. It's cost-free for him to traffic in annexation. But as a bargaining chip, the way he did in 2020. Now, he didn't know how 2020 would unfold with the Emiratis, but it worked out very well for him to say, oh, I'm for annexation. Oh, if this is the price, I'll give it up for 4 years. That was the cost for him. Does he try to repeat that and say, this time I'll give it up for 8 years? I think Trump will be clear, like, do this deal. This is the ultimate legacy. This is not just one Nobel Prize. This is 2 Nobel Prizes for me if I get this deal. How do you see a Netanyahu government navigating it when Smotrich and Ben-Gvir would say, of course we're for it if we get it for free, but we don't want to pay?
After 17 years of Netanyahu in power, I'm so sick of trying to analyze what's his next move, what's he going to do, what's his motive. I just so desperately want to be free of this guy. I just can't bear it anymore. I can't bear these endless Netanyahu speculations that he has us all in his head and he's in our heads. And I'm trying to free myself of him because sometimes I feel like I literally can't breathe. What? This guy, he's still there. He's still making life and death decisions for this country after October 7th, after the judicial coup. This guy, after everything he's done to this country in the last few years, this guy is still in charge of our lives, and I can't bear it. That's my answer to you. I just can't bear it. And if you think about even the question, what will he do? Will he go with the dream peace agreement, the end of the Sunni Arab-Israeli war, the 75, 80-year-old war that is the Arab-Israeli conflict? Or will he go with Smotrich and Ben-Gvir? And think about how unbelievable it is that MBS is most likely not going to demand the creation of a Palestinian state as a precondition for peace. He'll want some commitments. He'll want us to commit to not annexing. He'll want us perhaps to freeze settlements outside the blocks, whatever it'll be. And any normative government, left, right, or center, would have grabbed this. And now we have a government that may jeopardize peace with Saudi Arabia and the end of the Arab-Israeli conflict. All right, there'll still be obviously the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. There still will be a Shiite-Israeli conflict, but the war of the Arab world against Israel will essentially be over. And think about how amazing it is, David. I think I'm a bit older than you, but you probably do remember the 1973 Arab oil boycott. At that time, we were convinced, rightly so, that the Arab oil-producing countries were Israel's greatest threat. They were the existential threat. They were turning us into an international pariah. Israel lost relations with almost the entire continent of Africa, most of Asia, in the aftermath of the oil boycott in 1973. And now, 50 years later, it's the oil-producing countries that are leading the trend for normalization with Israel. And yet now we're going to be the obstacles. I just don't know what to do with that.
I want your views on three different things, which is the whole issue of a national commission of inquiry, the draft issue, the issue of the judicial overhaul. I want to know, where do you think the public is on this? Let's start with the commission of inquiry. Every Israeli war where there's been a huge failure, it's been self-understood that there was a commission of national inquiry. And yet here we're hearing all sorts of permutations that would somehow give it a more of a political gloss. It seems hard to believe the Israeli public will not go to the streets by the millions because it would want this commission of inquiry to be formed. Or do you say, look, the Israeli public is also tired? I mean, look what's happened just in the last several years. I think, 4 rounds of elections, COVID, the judicial overhaul that brought people to the streets every Saturday night and during the week too. And then the October 7th war in Gaza, wars with Lebanon, and go on and on. I mean, is there a fatigue factor, or do you think this issue of a commission of national inquiry is so foundational for Israel after a failure that you just can't imagine it not being formed?
Listening to you go through these last few years, Israel has always endured in excess of history, but in the last few years, we've really overdone it. We've really exaggerated. And yeah, people are tired. Just listening to your list made me feel this deep sense of exhaustion. But this government is vulnerable on two issues. The first is the Commission of Inquiry, and the second is the drafting of the ultra-orthodox. And polls show that there are strong majorities on both of these issues against the government. My hope is that the democratic movement, which I've been deeply a part of, especially leading up to October 7th, will change tactics.
That's democracy in Israel. We're not talking about Democrats or Republicans in the United States, just for our listeners.
That's democracy, saving democracy in Israel. And my hope is that the Israeli democracy movement will switch tactics. Because if we continue to oppose the government on the basis of democracy, the government is destroying democracy. Yes, left to its own devices, this government would destroy democracy. It would destroy our democratic institutions, the courts, and the media above all. And it would destroy, it already is in its way, trying to destroy the democratic ethos of the country. But what we saw in your elections just now was that when you run on a campaign of saving democracy, which is what the Democrats ran on, that's not a winning argument. People don't necessarily vote for democracy, and it's sobering, it's depressing, but certainly the same is true here in Israel. What we need to be focusing on, we, the democratic movement, the way to bring this government down is by focusing on these two issues. The issue of the ultra-orthodox draft, mass draft deferment, wholesale exemption for military service, and the absence of a commission of inquiry, which you rightly point out was a given in any crisis in the past. Going back again to 1973, I was a student in Israel. I was on the one-year program at Hebrew University in the year of the Yom Kippur War. And I saw the emergence of the protest movement that brought down Golda Meir, the prime minister at the time, and the legendary defense minister, Moshe Dayan, both of whom bore tremendous responsibility for the failure of the initial days of the war. And yet, when you compare the failure in Yom Kippur to the failure on October 7th, Netanyahu's failure is so much greater for a very simple reason. He was warned repeatedly by the security establishment that if you continue to pursue your divisive policy of judicial overhaul, you are going to invite an invasion. Now, no one knew it would come from Hamas. That was the blind spot. The assumption was it would be coming from the north.
You would invite invasion, just for our listeners so they understand that you're saying because the Arabs would interpret it as weakness if the pilots stop flying or they don't go to reserve duty.
Yes, and that the country was so deeply divided.
And Nasrallah gave speeches at the time saying Israel's never been so divided.
That's right. And, they always underestimate us, our enemies. That's the pattern, but that's a whole other conversation. So the government really is very vulnerable on these two issues. And I would throw in a third issue, which is the hostages. If not all the hostages are freed soon, then that could trigger a new major protest movement. And we saw it happening here briefly when the 6 hostages were killed by Hamas about 2 months ago. And hundreds of thousands took to the streets, the largest anti-government demonstrations that we've ever had here. These are the issues that we need to focus on.
I think it's not a coincidence that you didn't mention something that maybe seems like background noise, but the Netanyahu's trial. He's taking the stand, and that will continue on for a couple months. And maybe he'll say, well, the public will feel, look, everything we need to know, we kind of already know. There's no real huge revelations here. And it doesn't seem like, he's paying a price for that. His numbers have gone up, maybe because of the shift in the balance of power with the successes in the north. I don't know. I mean, it's interesting. That seems like you see it as a kind of a non-issue politically.
First of all, in terms of his numbers, they've gone up, but every poll continues to show a vast gap between his personal popularity, which I find astonishing, and his ability to form a coalition.
He still doesn't have 61.
No, he's so far from that. He has 50, 52. He's nowhere near 61.
And that's what people need to understand, that for our American listeners, it's not enough to be personally popular. You need to be able to fashion a coalition to get to 61, which is the bare majority in a 120-member Knesset.
As far as this trial goes, I really don't know how this is going to play out. So far, it's probably working in his favor. Well, first of all, the prosecution hasn't spoken yet. In Israel, the defense presents first. And so Netanyahu has had, softball pitches from his attorneys.
It's the cross-examination where things could get more interesting, you're saying?
Yeah, it could get more interesting. And right now, I think there's a lot of fatigue that is playing in Netanyahu's favor. People are saying, really, do we really need our prime minister on trial 3 days a week when the Middle East is convulsing? What works in Netanyahu's favor is also the perception that the prosecution is going after him for petty issues, cigars and champagne. Of course, it's far more insidious than that. The accusation is that his wife received very expensive gifts, jewels and other gifts, and that Netanyahu knew exactly what he was doing wrong in receiving very large quantities of cigars and champagne. And he had code words for them, and everything was done surreptitiously. You don't behave that way if you don't think you're committing a crime. We don't know yet how it's going to play out, but I think that if you asked most Israelis, do you regret that the trial happened at all? I think most people would say yes, as would I, because Netanyahu's assault against the judiciary is a direct response to his trial. How dare you humiliate me by putting me on trial? I'm going to show you, I'm going to get back at the judicial system. And I think a large part of what we've experienced in Israel in the last 2 years has been Netanyahu's revenge against the state of Israel, as terrible as it is to say that about one's prime minister.
With the soft right voters, I mean, that seems like the holy grail. Everyone wants that soft right voter. Do you see shifts there? I mean, we look at the polling data, we see someone like Naftali Bennett, who's a right-wing guy, but yet he projects that Israel needs unity. It can't afford just having people in the end zones. He hasn't yet said Smotrich and Ben-Gvir, but he has said, and I've seen him say this, for the next 20 years, we need the center right and the center left working together on some of Israel's most difficult problems. And he's mentioned the Haredi issue, the ultra-orthodox, as something where the public needs to come together. I'm wondering if the fatigue factor, this belief that polarization is corrosive for Israel in a horrific way, is going to lead to a shift in sentiment to say, well, we still want a leader who's right of center, but we want one who's going to work with the center and the center left. And that was the old Netanyahu, by the way.
Yes, it
when
was.
He was what I would say, the pilot of an airplane who would say, I want a wing to my right, a wing to my left, and I want to navigate the plane between those wings. And he seems to have given up on what I call the pilot theory of leadership, of navigation, by having wings on both sides and flying a plane with just one wing, which is challenging.
Well, he's given up because he doesn't have a liberal wing against which to balance anymore.
And by the way, here, I want to ask you on self-reflection on this one, because I do wonder if there's a need for some self-reflection on the center to say, look, it was a mistake to say, we won't join you. And we are going to put you in chayra, meaning we're going to banish you until you finish your trial, which maybe you understand for certain reasons. But Netanyahu said, okay, you left me no choice. Of course I had to go with the hard right. That's the only other game in town. In the end, the center did go with him after October 7th because it was a national emergency. But I do wonder if there's a need for some self-reflection, like you mentioned on the trial even. Did people nudge him to the hard right? I'm not trying to absolve him of responsibility, but...
Look, I think that my camp needs to have some self-reckoning, in particular how the pilot's refusal to serve backfired against us and really alienated many people who were otherwise sympathetic to what we were saying. But on this particular issue, I don't feel any regret. Netanyahu left us no choice. Don't forget that Benny Gantz entered into a coalition with Netanyahu before October 7th. And they had an agreement, and
he reneged.
Big surprise. Everyone understood who we're dealing with. Netanyahu burned every bridge. You know, in Hebrew we say he earned his situation. I don't know how to translate it. You know, he earned this fair and square. That's the way to translate it. He earned his isolation fair and square. He created his own reality. Now, of course, we've paid an enormous price for that. But even so, you know, when Benny Gantz finally left the government again for the second time, it was also a case of such bad faith on Netanyahu's part. Netanyahu is a man without scruples, absolutely without scruples. And he has confused being a canny and shrewd and even ruthless politician with being a totally unprincipled politician. And there's a difference. Sometimes it's a fine line, but he's erased that line.
What are the lessons of 2024 for you going into 2025 that gives you hope, that would say the Israeli public did show resilience after the lowest point of October 7th and had all these successes on the battlefield? And always the question is, can you lock them into strategic gains? How does Israel learn from 2024? You channel this resilience in a way that can bring people together and not tear them apart.
Well, the truly astonishing success of Israeli society on October 8th wasn't that we showed resilience in response to catastrophe. We always do that. But that we were able to come together from the lowest point of national disunity in the country's history. The transition from October 6th to October 8th was breathtaking. We went from a country that was tearing itself apart, where we didn't know if there would be any commonality left when this was all over, to instantly pivoting to one of the peak moments of national unity in Israel's history. What we have as a society are two models. Again, I'm not speaking strategically now. I'm not speaking in terms of our relations with the region, but in terms of our relations with ourselves, with each other. We have two models. We have the model leading up to October 7th, that terrible year where the government was assaulting the Israeli democratic ethos and basically telling Israeli liberals, you don't have a future in this country, which is how we felt. That was the message we were getting. To October 8th, which is the totally opposite model of Israel is back. And no, we didn't lose the instincts of peoplehood, the instincts of Jewish solidarity. These are the two models that are now confronting us. Which one will we choose? The Torah admonishes us in one of the more sobering lines of the Torah, and you shall choose life, meaning you have a choice. You actually can choose death. You can choose suicide. You can choose self-destruction. In the year leading up to October 7th, we were a society that was choosing death. And after October 7th, we chose life. The great internal decision, which will affect everything. It will affect our ability to turn our military victories over the last year into strategic diplomatic victories. It will affect our ability to stop a nuclear Iran. Will we choose the path of social solidarity? And that's going to be the big struggle of the coming year.
And do you have a intuition about what would tip it in what direction?
I think we will choose life, but maybe just barely. It's going to be a very brutal struggle because this government shows every indication of setting the clock back to October 6th. But there are so many factors here that could thwart the government.
So what could tip it?
A vote on the ultra-orthodox draft exemption.
The Commission of Inquiry.
Yeah, and what if the government loses that vote? It's unlikely, but not impossible. In other words, that there will be defections from within the Likud. That is not impossible. Maybe even from the far right, whose constituencies are very upset at the wholesale exemption of the ultra-Orthodox. There are so many variables here. Israel is always a fluid reality. This is one of the most dynamic countries in good ways and unnerving ways. I think never so fluid as it is now.
On this hopeful note that Israel will choose life, I want to thank you very much, Yossi Klein-Halevi, for summarizing 2024 and giving us some hope for 2025 that the solidarity that brought Israel back from the depths of October 6th to a more kind of unified approach as it faced all these wars, that solidarity will somehow win out despite all the forces of division arrayed against it. I just want to thank you very much, and thank you for joining us today on Decision Points.
Well, thanks for having me, David. Great to be with you.
As 2024 draws to a close, it is a year defined by remarkable and even breathtaking achievements that have reshaped the balance of regional power. Yet there remains deep polarization within Israeli society that should not be overlooked. Israel's response to the catastrophe of October the 7th was unprecedented. While Israeli society is used to coming together in the face of an external threat, that time reflected Israel coming together despite the internal divisions that were ripping the country apart. Today, there's growing fear that these divisions are re-emerging, stoked by elements within Netanyahu's coalition. Domestic challenges abound. It has always been assumed that a searing National Commission of Inquiry to investigate failures would happen after the October 7th war ended. Yet there are clear indications that the government may seek to avoid this inquiry. Moreover, the possibility of permanent exemption of the ultra-Orthodox from the military draft is hugely unpopular. Furthermore, the government's approach to hostage negotiations is increasingly seen as its Achilles heel. On the hostage question, public patience is wearing thin, and a partial deal that leaves soldiers behind in Gaza risks being viewed by the public as insufficient. If this coalition falls, it will not be due to external threats, but rather because of internal divisions on these key domestic issues. As we look forward to 2025, The question remains, will Israel manage to leave behind its internal divisions that in part led to the October 7th catastrophe? Or will the society manage to recover its long-cherished sense of cohesion and return to national unity? I want to thank all our listeners around the world for listening to another episode of Decision Points. I want to add, with the holidays approaching, this will be our last episode of 2024. Make sure you subscribe to Decision Points on your favorite podcast app so you can listen to our new episodes in 2025. Thank you to my dedicated team of research assistants at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. I want to thank Rena Gabbert, Simone Seidmayer, Sydney Hilbush, and Gabriel Epstein. I also want to thank Rob, Hadia, and the production team at Podville Media, and listeners like yourselves for making this podcast possible. Please leave us a 5-star review so we can continue to grow this community. Subscribe to Decision Points on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Acast, or wherever you get your podcasts. And if you're on WhatsApp, X, or a variety of social media platforms, I invite you to share this show with your friends. To our listeners from all over the world, thank you for listening to this season of Decision Points.